In 77 AD, Roman soldiers marched a 15-year-old enslaved girl named Blandina through the dripping stone corridors beneath the Colosseum. The air was thick with the stench of iron, sweat, and animal filth. Above her, 50,000 spectators roared for blood and distraction. Over the next 3 days, what happened to that girl would send shockwaves through the empire itself, and centuries later, help undermine the very system that killed her. But even that isn't the real nightmare. For almost 2,000 years, the full truth of what was done to captive women in the arena has been edited, softened, or completely erased. School textbooks show you heroic gladiator duels. Museum plaques talk about spectacle, games, and public entertainment. What they don't tell you is that before the main show began, there was a ritual, codified by law and normalized by culture, that turned enslaved and condemned women into disposable offerings. They don't explain why, in the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists quietly walked away from certain excavation areas around the Colosseum when the evidence of what really happened became too disturbing to package as tourist history. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand 3 things your history class never spelled out. First, the pre-game ritual that Roman law demanded, and why modern historians often skip the details when they summarize it in a single vague phrase. Second, the execution method was so cruel it had its own legal category, and how it was weaponized specifically against women. And third, how modern archaeological and forensic work reveals that the horror wasn't rare, wasn't symbolic, and wasn't exaggerated. It was systematic. If you're ready to walk into one of the darkest rooms of Roman history, hit subscribe now, because it gets much worse from here. And stick with me up to around the 8-minute mark, when we'll look at an inscription someone tried to literally erase from the stone. Let's build the world first. Imagine Rome around 100 AD. On the surface, it's marble, gold, and engineering genius. Aqueducts, temples, forums, a stadium so advanced it might as well be science fiction for its time. But underneath that polished stone is a machine that runs on human beings. Here's the number that usually hides in a footnote, if it's mentioned at all: roughly 60 million slaves across the empire. That's not servants with rights. That's 1 out of every 3 people classified as property, something to be bought, sold, beaten, traded, or discarded. The Colosseum alone could pack in about 50,000 people. It had 28 elevators to haul wild animals from the underworld of cages to the blinding light of the arena floor. It had a massive retractable shade sail run by sailors trained to handle ropes like they were rigging for a warship. It had drainage systems to empty fake naval battle pools. You hear that stuff all the time in documentaries. But here's what comes up less often. Beneath all that clever engineering, there were rows of holding cells. Not a handful, dozens. And the majority of those cells were not for gladiators. They were filled with women, war captives dragged from Germania, Britannia, North Africa, the Middle East. Local criminals, whose offenses included being Christian, refusing an arranged marriage, or simply being in the wrong house when soldiers came through the neighborhood. Every one of them knew they were not being held for a trial. They were inventory, scheduled for use. For most, a clean execution would have been a mercy they weren't going to get. For decades, popular history obsessed over the gladiators, their armor types, their diet, their training schools. The lower tunnels and what went on inside them usually got summarized with a tidy phrase: entertainment for the masses. But in 1952, while stabilizing a collapsed section of the hypogeum, the underground structure, an Italian restorer named Giovanni Carbonara reportedly came across something that didn't fit the postcard version of Rome. Scratched into the stone were 6 Latin words. Translated, they read, "They took her screaming. Mars, forgive us." Think about that. Mars was the god of war, violence, bloodshed, conquest, not compassion, not pity. For a citizen of an empire that crucified rebels by the thousands to feel compelled to ask the war god for forgiveness, that tells you the people down there weren't just indifferent functionaries. At least one of them felt that what was happening in those tunnels crossed a line even Rome didn't like to admit existed. And the thing is, this isn't guesswork. What I'm about to describe isn't just rumor or legend. It's documented in legal texts, church records, and the writings of people who were actually there. So here's your warning. If you think you know where this is going, you probably don't. The Romans had a term for one category of punishment, damnatio ad lupana, condemnation to the brothel. Except the brothel, in this context, wasn't a building off in the red light quarter. The arena itself functioned as that space. Before the main spectacles, the animal hunts and gladiatorial battles, the guards brought out female captives as a kind of opening act and reward system. Certain women were branded in law as infames, people without honor, beneath legal protection. The Lex Julia Devi Publica and related statutes basically said, once you were in that category, your body was no longer protected by the normal rules. You didn't count. The crowd knew exactly what that meant. Vendors moved through the stands selling wine and roasted nuts. Families ate lunch. Children sat on their parents' laps. And while they snacked, the pre-game entertainment unfolded. This wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was on the program. You might be tempted to think, okay, but surely the sources are vague. Surely modern historians are reading between the lines. The uncomfortable answer is no. We have names, we have quotes. Tertullian, an early Christian writer in Carthage around 200 AD, wrote a work called De Spectaculis, on the shows. In it, he describes attending the games and being forced to watch as women were handed over to gladiators as part of their rewards and as elements of theatrical punishments. And here's the detail. Nobody puts on souvenir mugs. This wasn't some illegal back alley deviation. The Roman Senate sanctioned it. Officials scheduled it. Particular festivals, such as the Ludi Romani in September, regularly included these so-called preliminary entertainments. The gladiators themselves weren't cartoon villains. Most were slaves or condemned prisoners, too. They were trapped inside the same machine, pressed into a role that demanded they perform violence on command, whether in combat or in these rewards. Records from the rebellion led by Spartacus around 73 BC mention demands to end the practice of women rewards, which implies this pattern was already entrenched long before the Colosseum's stone was even laid. Now imagine you're not in the stands. You're one of the women in those cells. You're chained in a cramped, filthy room that reeks of excrement and dried blood. You hear the muffled roar of the audience above you every time an animal is released or a blade strikes. You don't have a court date. You don't have a lawyer. In the eyes of Roman law, you are a non-person. No appeal. No rights. No way out. No way out. One woman, her name lost or deliberately not preserved, refused to go quietly. Tertullian mentions a woman who, when the guards came to drag her out, fought back so fiercely that two of them needed medical treatment. In a system built on obedience and predictability, that kind of resistance couldn't be allowed to pass. So the organizers escalated. If she wouldn't perform in the preliminaries, they would turn her into the main event, using one of Rome's most sensational forms of execution. That sentence had a name too, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It sounds straightforward, but the reality was almost theatrical in its cruelty. The Romans didn't simply throw condemned people into a pit and hope a lion got hungry. They staged myth. Roman audiences loved their stories about gods, heroes, and monstrous punishments. Hercules, Perseus, Prometheus, the cursed queens and violated victims of legend. At some point, someone in charge asked a chilling question. What if we performed the myths literally? The result was the fatal charade, a staged reenactment of a myth in which the violence was real and the victim actually died. Female captives, especially, were slotted into roles from myths involving humiliation, violation, and slow death. The poet Martial, writing in the time of the Colosseum's inauguration under Emperor Titus, describes a performance of the myth of Pasiphae, the queen doomed to an obscene union with a bull. He hints at a real woman playing her part, a real animal present in the arena. If you think that's just poetic exaggeration, Josephus, the Jewish historian who also witnessed arena games, backs it up from another angle. He writes of a woman playing Dirce, tied to a bull and dragged to her death, her screams very real, her body very real. This wasn't chaos. It was engineered. Archaeological studies of the hypogeum layout have shown a network of pulleys, elevators, trapdoors, and mechanical devices designed to raise sets, cages, and people at precisely timed moments. There were animal trainers who specialized in teaching lions, bears, bulls, and leopards to attack in ways that prolonged suffering. Surviving texts on animal handling describe how to condition a predator to maim without immediately killing. One inscription lists staff roles for the games: bestiarius, animal handler; editor, producer of the games, and likely carpter or cartha, a role scholars interpret as a costume or prop specialist for these fatal performances. According to the tradition Tertullian repeats, the resisting woman we mentioned was costumed as Prometheus. In the myth, Prometheus is chained to a rock while an eagle devours his liver, which regenerates so the torment can repeat forever. The Romans reenacted it. They bound her to a post and released a trained bird of prey. Tertullian says she endured multiple attacks before finally dying, while the crowd watched, placed bets, and commented on how long she would last. Pause for a second. If you're still here, you're obviously not the kind of person who wants history sugar-coated. You believe we should look at what actually happened, not just the sanitized version. So before we go further, make sure you're subscribed, because in an upcoming video I'm going to break down what Roman soldiers did to conquered cities that modern textbooks hide behind phrases like standard military occupation. Spoiler, there was nothing standard about it. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, this is horrific, but at least we know the worst, and it's all in the distant past. That's what I thought too, until I started looking at what modern archaeology and forensic work around the Colosseum suggests. For centuries, scholars measured that building from every angle. They mapped the seating, the corridors, the drainage channels. So when, in the late 2010s, conservation work on the less visited eastern side of the structure exposed a small chamber with human remains, most people assumed it would just be another data point. Some random burials tied to the medieval or later reuse of the site. Instead, what they slowly uncovered painted a much darker pattern. Inside were the skeletons of women, many of them very young. The bones showed signs of long-term malnutrition, not outright starvation, but the kind of controlled, minimal diet that keeps a captive alive while keeping them weak. Several skeletons had healed fractures, broken ribs, arms, or legs that had mended, meaning these women had survived earlier injuries and been kept alive afterward. Grooves on the wrist and ankle bones suggested repeated restraint by shackles or tight bindings. Isotope analysis pointed to origins across the empire, some from northern Europe, some from North Africa, some from the eastern Mediterranean. Many were in the age range we would consider teens and young adults. In other words, these weren't one-time accident victims. They weren't soldiers killed in battle. They were a population that had been held, used, injured, patched up just enough to continue, and eventually disposed of. If you connect that physical evidence to the legal categories and written accounts we've already talked about, a disturbing picture emerges. The arena wasn't just a place of public killing. It functioned as a system for long-term exploitation, ritualized punishment, and staged execution, especially for women. One reported detail from that chamber haunts me. Among the remains, one skeleton had something clutched in its hand. The bones of the fingers had fused around a small object. Careful cleaning revealed a tiny wooden cross, crudely carved, about 2 inches tall. Dating techniques placed it around the same period as the bones. That means the woman died holding the symbol of a faith the Roman state was actively trying to crush. She died as an anonymous Christian martyr, never named in any text, but preserving her faith in the last muscles of her hand. And that brings us back to the one martyr whose name did survive, Blandina, the teenage slave girl from Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in France. She was enslaved and Christian at a time when both of those facts made her expendable. During the crackdown on Christians under Marcus Aurelius in 77 AD, she was arrested with others and eventually taken to the games. Our main source for what happened is a letter from Christians in Lugdunum to communities in Asia Minor, preserved later by the church historian Eusebius. For centuries, scholars assumed the account was exaggerated, too detailed, too dramatic. But when you lay it next to what we've just discussed, legal categories, fatal charades, forensic patterns, it suddenly looks disturbingly plausible. On the first day of the games, Blandina was tied to a stake in the arena. Animals were released around her. The letter says something unexpected happened. The beasts refused to attack. Sometimes that really did happen. If animals were overfed or stressed, they wouldn't behave on cue. Crowds sometimes interpreted this as a sign from the gods. In Blandina's case, the editor of the games ordered her taken back to the cells. On day 2, they attempted a version of Damnatio ad Lupana. She was offered to gladiators as part of the preliminaries. According to the letter, a gladiator named Marcus refused to participate. For a slave whose survival depended on obeying the will of the editor, that was career and life suicide. He was executed immediately. 2 more gladiators, emboldened by his stand, also refused. Suddenly, the tightly controlled schedule of the games cracked. The crowd grew restless. A riot threatened. Officials had to intervene. On the 3rd day, the authorities decided to crush this spark of resistance publicly. Blandina was whipped with the flagrum, a multi-thonged whip embedded with metal and bone designed to tear flesh. Then she was placed in a superheated iron chair. Then, finally, she was sewn into a net and thrown before a bull, which gored her to death. The letter emphasizes not just her suffering, but her refusal to curse her faith or ask the crowd for mercy. Her death and the refusal of gladiators to play their assigned roles caused a political headache. The games were supposed to display the power of the empire and the favor of the gods. Instead, this episode showcased how much that power relied on the forced participation of both victims and executioners. Within a few decades, under Septimius Severus, reforms were issued later preserved in compilations like the Theodosian Code that began to restrict how and when women could be used in these preliminary entertainments, and that recognized damnatio ad bestias as a particularly cruel penalty. Did it end the abuse? No, the machine didn't shut down overnight. But stories like Blandina's didn't disappear. They circulated in Christian communities. Her name became attached to churches. Her feast day, June 2nd, is still observed in some Christian traditions today. Ironically, the very system that tried to use spectacular death to erase a religion ended up preserving that religion's stories. Accounts of martyrdom were copied obsessively, becoming some of the most detailed records we have of that era. By 325 AD, Emperor Constantine had embraced Christianity and issued laws that limited executions in the arena. The Munera Sine Missione games, without mercy, where no one was spared, were curtailed. The fatal charades began to disappear. The Colosseum, once the heart of Rome's blood entertainment, slowly shifted into a symbol of pagan cruelty in Christian memory. But let's be blunt, this didn't happen because Roman elites suddenly grew a conscience. It happened because the empire was under economic strain. Importing exotic animals became ruinously expensive. The supply of slaves was shrinking, and Christianity had become too large and too politically important to exterminate. The last recorded damnatio ad bestias comes from around 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to break up a gladiator fight. The crowd stoned him to death on the spot. Horrified, Emperor Honorius supposedly issued a final ban on gladiatorial combat just days later. So what are we left with? Hundreds, perhaps thousands of women whose names we'll never know, used as disposable bodies in a system that called it entertainment. Legal documents that coldly categorized them as infames. Skeletal remains that quietly testify to long-term captivity, repeated injuries, restraints, pregnancies, and deliberate neglect. A teenager named Blandina, whose refusal to play her assigned role helped, in a very small way, to undermine the spectacle that killed her. And a ruined stadium that tourists photograph today without realizing just how many lives it processed. Today, organizations like UNESCO and Italian cultural agencies mark sites around the Colosseum as memorials to human rights. Plaques speak of nameless victims and suffering written in stone. But even now, not all the evidence has been made easily accessible. Some excavation reports remain unpublished or buried in specialist journals. Some details are softened for public consumption. So here's my question to you, and I want you to really sit with it before you type a comment. Should modern Rome, and by extension, institutions like the Catholic Church that now stand where pagan power once stood, issue a formal apology for what happened in those arenas? On one side, people argue that modern Italians aren't responsible for crimes committed nearly 2 millennia ago. On the other hand, some say acknowledgement of past atrocities matters, regardless of how much time has passed, because memory is part of justice. Where do you stand? Tell me in the comments. If this episode disturbed you, and it should have, then you're exactly the kind of person I make these videos for. We're not here for the sanitized version of history. We're here for the parts that textbooks compress into one bland sentence like public entertainment, when in reality, what Roman gladiators and officials did to captive women went far beyond simple execution. So if you want more unfiltered deep dives into the side of Roman power your teachers skipped, make sure you hit like, click subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Next, watch the video I've linked on what really happened to conquered populations under Roman pacification, and what children's skeletons in places like Pompeii tell us about who really paid the price for the empire. History isn't supposed to make you comfortable, it's supposed to make you see clearly. I'll see you in the next one.